Welcome to the author interviews for Liberty Matters, a forum of various authors and texts available on the Online Library of Liberty. The Online Library of Liberty is part of the Liberty Fund network of websites. For more information about Liberty Fund, visit our webpage at www.libertyfund.org. I'm Pat Lynch, a senior fellow from the Liberty Fund, and today I'm joined by John Grove, who has written one of the response essays for our March 2021 forum on John C. Calhoun. If you'd like to watch any of the other interviews by the authors from this forum or any of the other interviews in this series, please visit our YouTube channel. A link to the forum itself on the Online Library of Liberty is also on our YouTube channel. John Grove is the associate editor of Law and Liberty here at Liberty Fund. Prior to joining Liberty Fund, he was associate professor of political science at Lincoln Memorial University. He received a PhD in political theory from Northern Illinois University and is the author of John C. Calhoun's Theory of Republicanism, published by the University of Kansas Press in 2016. He's published academic and non-academic work in Polity, American Political Thought, National Affairs, The American Conservative, and other outlets. John, thanks a lot for joining us today and taking time out of your day to participate in the authors forum, the authors interviews here for Liberty Matters.
Thanks, Pat.
John, I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about something that is actually not so much in the essay that you wrote for the forum, but is in your widely lauded book. And I'd recommend anyone who's interested in Calhoun to pick up a copy of it. It's available on Amazon. And that is in that text, you argue that Calhoun draws from something called classical republicanism rather than a theory of individual rights. So can you explain for our viewers what that distinction means and how it cashes out in terms of the way Calhoun thinks about political institutions and how it gets him to where he ends up?
Sure, yeah. So the distinction can kind of be drawn at a very academic level, but then also at a just broader historical level. So in the book, I'm linking Calhoun a little bit to some of the debates about how to understand the American founding period, which often hinged back like 30, 40 years ago, really hinged on this debate about whether the American founding was classical liberal or classical Republican. So I kind of engaged that a little bit. Today, people are usually more inclined to say that the founding was a little bit of a mixture of both of those. But so I'm linking Calhoun into some of that scholarly work on American political thought, but I also try to link him a little bit more to a kind of broad historical trends, and I emphasize the classical in Calhoun. And that one of the big takeaways I have about Calhoun is that he was really his broad political theory was really focused on trying to apply some kind of classical insights about government that he gleaned from Aristotle, Cicero, Polybius, Machiavelli, and others to the kind of unique situation of modern states. So trying to discern some elements of classical political thought, much of which was Republican in character in some sense. So what I mean by that then, to what kind of brings both of those together, both the kind of the academic and the kind of more broad historical sense of that term, is that as a political thinker, I think Calhoun was mostly focused on what a kind of well-functioning, self-governing society looks like, what government looks like when it is genuinely ordered and run by the society over which it governs. And for him, obviously, for anybody who's read the essays in the forum, for him, that obviously meant a lot more than just majority rule elections. So that can in some sense can be contrasted with the idea of a kind of classical liberal thinker who would be more focused on kind of specific individual rights that government protects. For the classical republicanism, or for the classical Republican, the focus was more on how society controls the government and avoids arbitrary power. So I think that's kind of the broad answer to that. The specifics that I try to pull out in the book are both at kind of a theoretical level and a practical level. So there are some specifics. So for instance, when he describes the purpose of government. He really emphasizes human beings' natural sociality, that we are naturally social beings that have to live with one another, that we have, it's a good in and of itself to live comfortably with one another. We reach, right, moral and intellectual heights together that we would never be able to reach individually. So in that sense, by kind of rooting government in sociality rather than kind of a state of nature, for instance, I think the classical Republican would see kind of individual freedom more as an outgrowth of a well-functioning society than as kind of the first premises of government.
So
and there's some other. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, it's a kind of a Aristotelian view of the world, right? That the natural sociability, and that society is sort of the basis rather than the individual. And so in that sense, it contrasts someone like Hobbes and Locke, or some people like Hobbes and Locke who are looking more at individual actors and then thinking about how to build up accordingly. He's using a more Aristotelian approach where you're looking at a society as a whole. Would that be a fair characterization?
I think so, yeah. And part of what goes into that then is this emphasis on virtue too. So you see a lot of this is a complicated question in people who for people who read Calhoun, but I think there's a lot of emphasis on virtue where Calhoun saw the kind of institutional structures that he talks about. It's easy to kind of look at them and see them in a kind of more of a kind of classical liberal mold that is, you balance government to protect, specific rights. But he really emphasized the sense in which institutional restraints on power were a kind of support for virtue too. That when you have certain institutions that channel political actors in certain ways, it forces people to think politically in terms of the whole. So, for instance, if you have a government that requires broad concurrence, the successful politician only succeeds when they are able to genuinely think of the whole, rather than kind of their part, rather than simply bringing home the pork barrel projects to your home district or something like that. You're not going to be able to do that because, right, somebody else is vetoing, right, your attempts to do that. So that his idea of concurrence required people to think in terms of the whole, so that the successful politicians that we kind of elevate and look up to are the ones who kind of display a kind of civic virtue that's able to think the way kind of in kind of the language of statesmanship.
It's interesting though, because in many ways Calhoun is thought of as a sectional politician, right? That he is somebody who's associated with a very sectional view in it. And let's explore a little bit of the mechanics of how that was supposed to. Now, one of the things that I think our viewers might not be completely aware of, but we can talk a little bit about this, is the differences between the United States during the Constitutional Convention of 1787 versus the United States of Calhoun's day, in which the context of the slave question had changed substantially. Yes, so where the founders were more of the opinion that slavery would eventually fade away or become economically unviable, or was not going to be a long-term problem. The America that Calhoun lived in had a slavery system that was very robust and very profitable. And yet there are still associations between a lot of the things that Calhoun's writing about in that founding generation. And one of them is this idea of interposition or the nullification question. And in fact, Madison tried to address that later in his life too. Can you explain for our viewers a little bit what was this interposition, what was this nullification, and how exactly was it supposed to work in Calhoun's system?
Right. So his idea kind of sprang from a kind of Jeffersonian tradition, goes back to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in the 1790s, and ultimately it found its kind of theoretical grounding in a certain view of the Constitution as a compact between states. So the idea that prior to the adoption of the Constitution, the states were pretty much free, independent actors. The Articles of Confederation had this very weak central government, but the states were the primary locus of political power and of political loyalty, and to use, right, language of sovereignty, the states were sovereign. And then, so the compact theory of the Constitution basically said that the Constitution didn't change that. the Constitution created a more powerful government. It delegated more authority to the national institutions, but that the states were still essentially the sovereign entities of the American political system. So what emerged then was this idea, well, what happens if you have an unconstitutional national law? And you saw Jefferson and James Madison start to kind of articulate this idea in the 1790s that, well, if there's a national law that is threatened, that is unconstitutional, this was in the Alien and Sedition Acts, which put a lot of limits on free press and on resident aliens in the United States, that if you have this law that's going to be enforced within the borders of a state is authorized essentially to get in the way, right? Essentially to say the federal government can't come in here and enforce the law. Now, in 1790s, it's worth noting that it never came to that, right? They put out some very suggestive language, but they never actually interfered with the execution of a federal law. So Calhoun drew on that over the tariff controversy that most in the South believed was an unconstitutional use of the taxing power because it wasn't it wasn't used for raising revenue, but it was instead used to kind of benefit a particular economic section, which is interesting that that's almost the most anachronistic part of the nullification argument now, because now today, I mean, the taxing power is unlimited. You can do anything with it. But that was actually widely believed in the South, that the tariff was unconstitutional. What Calhoun did then was say, well, if you have if you believe in the compact theory of the Union, which again most of his colleagues did, and most people in the South did, then you have potentially this avenue by which the state can essentially get in the way of the execution of the law and say we're following the higher authority, which is the Constitution, over an act of Congress. And he likened it to the power of judicial review, which wasn't really stated in the Constitution, but the court, in going about its normal responsibilities, has to decide, do you follow the Constitution, do you follow statute? And he basically argued the state does the same thing. The state is going to say, do we stand by and let the federal government enforce an unconstitutional law, or do we do something about it? So what was distinctive about his idea was that what Madison and Jefferson had suggested, and again, it was pure suggestion, was that the state legislatures would do this. And I think what makes Calhoun's theory of nullification just more theoretically interesting was that he had a problem with that, because he said the state legislatures aren't really the authority of the Constitution. What the authority behind the Constitution came from the people in the state who ratified the Constitution through a state convention. So he argued that if a state is going to nullify, it has to actually go through a state convention that's specifically called to answer a constitutional question. And so he said the state would go through that. If the convention decided to nullify the law, then it would then essentially it would authorize the state to interpose and prevent federal enforcement, unless, he said, here again where his mind was kind of all in, kind of intertwined with constitutional context, was that he said unless 3/4 of the other states passed convention, essentially convention, if 3/4 of the other states had conventions that essentially declared, no, this is a constitutionally valid provision. Why 3/4? Because that's the amending power in the Constitution. So he basically said the ultimate power of the Constitution is 3/4 of the states, because they can change it. So in that sense, he tried to kind of make nullification into this kind of broader kind of constitutional remedy to constitutional crisis. So if you have an extreme moment where differences over the Constitution are threatening essentially to tear the Union apart, then you go to the source of authority of the Constitution, right? Which, as roughly as you can get it, which was the people in the state's convention. So that, broadly speaking, I think was his conception of how it would work.
I guess looking at that answer now, it sort of still looks as if he's created a standard by which he's protecting the institution and the region that he's most associated with, without solving the fundamental problem, because the by that time, the United States is fairly divided in terms of the number of slave states and the number of free states, and it's not obvious that that's going to change or provide any context in which three-quarters of the population or three-quarters of the states would be able to agree on what was constitutional or unconstitutional regarding slavery.
Right. Yeah. So he kind of acknowledges that, right? That the three quarters standard stacks the deck against federal power.
Right.
Basically, he said, well, that's the better option, is to stack the deck against federal power than to stack it for federal power, which is what he basically said was, if you don't have any authority of the states to participate in constitutional interpretation, then you allow the federal government to interpret its own power, which stacks the deck in its favor. So that was mainly his answer to that it would be difficult to get three quarters of the states to affirm a power. And if I recall right, I think he kind of acknowledges that it doesn't really definitively state that the Constitution did or did not authorize the power, but it's as close of a remedy as you get to going back to the authority of the Constitution, which I think that was what his understanding was.
It's interesting. He's got another interesting little detail that you mentioned very briefly in your essay, and I know you don't dwell on it very much, but I think it's one that it's worth sharing with our viewers, and that is this idea of a dual executive. What was the thinking behind that, and how is that going to function?
So this was a really minor suggestion that came in right at the very end of his life. I usually only mention it when other people mention it, but it does always seem to come up, even in a very casual overview of Calhoun's thinking. It almost always seems to be there. But basically, at the end of his book, The Discourse on the Constitution, which was an unfinished book. Well, it was finished, but he hadn't finished editing it and revising it. But posthumously published, where he kind of goes over in great detail his view of what the American Constitution looked like. He suggests at the end that the United States was at a point, this was 1850 when he died, the United States was at a point where the current institutions were not going to hold it together, that if the Union was going to be maintained, there was going to have to be some huge institutional compromise that fundamentally changed the political context between the two sections. And he mentions as a possibility the idea of a dual executive. It's very brief. He doesn't expand on it. It's the type of thing that obviously, right, if it had been made as a formal proposition, that would have all sorts of details that would have had to have been figured out. But what it comes out of, I think the reason why, if he was going to just casually suggest something, the reason it would be a dual executive was because he had increasingly believed that the presidency was emerging as the focal point of political competition in the United States, and that more and more as we went on, political discord and tension and uncertainty was going to center on presidential elections, because presidential elections, to get to a broader theme, really, presidential elections were where the most power was increasingly being concentrated. Of all the ways you participate in your government, the place that was starting to stand out as the place where you have the most possibility of kind of grasping the most authority at any given time was the presidency. So more and more you were going to have, right, uncertainty and instability around presidential elections. And so what he saw basically, where you have a sectional conflict over that tends to boil up around presidential elections. Well, you have some grand constitutional compromise where you select two executives. Presumably, he had something like the Roman model in mind. Where you would need the concurrence of two voices in order to do most of the things of the executive. But again, he never really elaborated on it. I think that's why he pointed to the executive, was because he had started for a long time. He had focused on the power of the executive, the the patronage that the executive has, the ability to influence other branches of the government through that patronage. So that's why I think he focused on the executive. But in terms of how it worked, what it looked like, he never really fleshed it out because he died.
Happens to all of us, unfortunately. Can't flesh all those. It's interesting. You're describing a person who had an ability to see where the republic was going in a very thoughtful and insightful way, because he could see the problems the union was facing. He could see the difficulty in the sectional politics. He could identify the growth and the power of the executive and the tensions that would emerge in 1860 after the election, and that's all very, very thoughtful. But now we have to turn to the Calhoun that unfortunately we also know, and that's the Calhoun who defended slavery. Let's start by maybe giving our viewers a little bit of context on how that discussion of slavery changed and how it suddenly had become the issue that would divide the nation, and how Calhoun fit in with other Southerners and the way they approached that slave discussion. So it went from slavery as the wolf by the ear, as described by one of the people he admired, Thomas Jefferson, to the institution that he ultimately defended on moral grounds. Can you explain how that all worked for Calhoun?
Yeah, well, I guess there's two evolutions that have to be traced. One is the economic evolution that made it clear that slavery wasn't going away anytime soon. And then the other was the ideological evolution that took place and was taking place throughout Calhoun's throughout his career. So part of what made the kind of necessary evil, wolf by the ears argument possible was this idea that slavery would be gradually going away, right? And of course that ended with cotton gin and all sorts of economic factors that I cannot explain because I don't fully understand. But it became clear by 1820s and 1830s that slavery wasn't fading away, and that created a kind of tension, I think. And this is me speculating a little bit broadly about kind of the evolution of ideas, but I think that created a bit of a tension with the wolf by the ears argument, that to where now you had essentially people acknowledging that slavery was evil, but at the same time continuing it with no real end in sight. And that's a little more problematic than saying, well, it's evil, but we hope it will be gone and within a couple generations. And so you had then the ideological evolution, I think, that went along with the economic change, and that was the evolution to a position that made the defense of slavery more permanent. That wasn't something that was looking at an end point at any point. And basically that was the paternalist argument for slavery. And this started to spread in the early 19th century, right around the turn of the century. And by the 1830s, it was pretty prevalent and getting to a point of dominance in the lower South. And it never quite took over all the slave states, because you still see at the time of the Civil War, especially in Virginia and the mid-Atlantic states, you still see people who very much held to the kind of necessary evil argument of the founding generations. But especially in the lower South states, you had more this paternalist ideal, which was basically the idea that slavery was integrated into the plantation household. That slavery was a system in which the interests and affections of black and white were kind of united. That the slaveholder had interests in taking care of and protecting and improving the slave. So the paternalist argument. The example of the paternalist argument is the problematic stuff in Gone with the Wind, right? If you want to see the kind of paternalist stuff, if you've seen the film, right, the slaves are kind of presented as, valued members of the household, respected, loved characters. They're loyal, and very much kind of part of this kind of cohesive whole. And Calhoun very much kind of imbibed that understanding of slavery, as far as you can tell, for his whole life. There's not much evidence of a shift at any point. In fact, there's evidence that very, very early in his career, before he before he even saw slavery as a big national political issue, he basically held this view. And that is the view then that also came out, in the Senate in 1837 in the Positive Good speech, and from there on to the end of his career, the next 13 years of his life, where he very much echoed that view.
Now, what's interesting is that in your essay, as compared to some of the other ones, you argue that Calhoun, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth here, but I think this sort of takes us to the next, and I think probably our last question, because I think we're going to spend some time on it, is this: how we balance his thoughts on slavery with his political thought. And this obviously doesn't just apply to someone like Calhoun. It applies to a wide range of thinkers, and we're going through a social process now where this is a discussion. And I think you and I think all the authors agree, the empirics are pretty clear on this. The plight of the slaves in the American South was horrible as compared to the rosy fantasies that Margaret Mitchell tried to pass off in the American public in the first part of the 20th century. And I think the empirical evidence is overwhelmingly clear on this point. So is it in your mind then that you can separate these things out, that Calhoun still gives us some useful understanding of the American Republic and the way we think about American democracy, the way we think about ourselves institutionally, or that this stain of slavery makes it very, very difficult to sort through it all, even if he wasn't, as you argue, an original thinker when it comes to this paternalistic argument, but that he had accepted it? Is there a way to filter it out, and is there something of value in his thought that we should continue to learn from? Or is this the case where we can't really disentangle this? And I know that the authors have somewhat different views on this. I'd like to hear yours on it.
Yeah, sure. So the way I would, I'll just kind of cut to the core of it. The way I've always kind of identified why you can kind of distinguish, right, his commitments to slavery from his broader political theory is by looking at some of the contradictions between them. So if you look at the paternalist view of slavery, one of the underlying assumptions of that was that you can have somebody who has unaccountable power over somebody else, and that they will use it beneficially. You could say that's the polar opposite of one of the core assumptions of concurrent constitutionalism, which is the very idea that you can't give somebody power over other people and just expect them to use it beneficially. All right, there always are going to have to be checks, and he roots that in his understanding of human nature. Right, in the Disquisition on Government, you see his understanding of human nature is that that's who we are. Right, when people have the opportunity to take advantage of others, they usually do it, and that's the problem that he kind of addresses from a political standpoint. The paternalist kind of view of slavery kind of lies right over that and just kind of assumes that the slaveholder is acting beneficially, and so that was a major contradiction. A good practical example too of another kind of contradiction is his regular discussion of slave rebellion, or the prospect of slave rebellion in the South. You see on a regular basis when he talks about slavery itself, he, along the lines of this ideology, he has to claim, well, nobody's really worried about slave rebellion, right? That's not a concern because, right, everything's fine. When he talks about abolitionism, the tune changes quite a bit, right? There's even a speech, I'm not going to be able to tell you exactly where it is, but speech on the regulation of abolitionist mailing through the U.S. mail. Interestingly, it was not a debate about whether to ban them, but who got to ban them. Andrew Jackson says the federal government ought to ban them. Calhoun said the state governments ought to ban them. And in arguing for the states instead of the federal government, he explicitly makes a distinction and basically said, look, some states have these problems that others don't, right? That some states are worried about, right, slave rebellions, where a kind of an implicit recognition that slavery made the southern states less free, and right, was not the kind of healthy political system that he claimed that it was. But to get to the again, those are just kind of two examples of kind of contradiction, right? At the end of the day, what I argue is if you read Calhoun's writings, speeches, he was a very, very thoughtful and careful thinker on constitutional political issues. And for the most part on slavery, he was basically repeating, right, the pretty well accepted ideology of his locale, without much thought, without much insight. And so I tend to agree with one of his biographers who basically just said he just wasn't all that interested. Right? He believed the ideology firmly, but when it came to thinking about slavery in any kind of critical way, he just wasn't interested. His mind was primarily focused on political and constitutional thought. And so what that means, I think, is that the insights he had about the purposes of government, what a constitution is supposed to do, the causes of political dysfunction are largely intellectually detached from his actual commitment to slavery. Yeah.
So in your view, and we'll end on this question, he is still relevant for us today in our highly partisan, divided America. You can set aside the paternalistic view of slavery and learn from Calhoun's analysis of the circumstances, which I think you made a pretty strong case that he was a pretty astute observer of politics in this period. But we can set aside that piece of who he was and learn from his prescriptions, or we can learn from him in other ways.
I say, yeah, for the most part, learn from him in other ways. You've pushed me very much to talk about the specifics, which sometimes I don't like to do as much, because I think the value in him comes from his broader understanding. So I've often noted that I approached Calhoun first by reading the Disquisition on Government, which was his theoretical treatise on the purpose of government, the purpose of constitutionalism in relationship to government. Slavery isn't there. The sectional conflict of the states is not there. It's not, the American context isn't there. I read that before I read anything else. So that maybe that skewed me in one way, or maybe maybe I was approaching it with a mind that was, cleared out of other things that could kind of see, I think, the value that's there. I think his value comes from that. His value for today is less about prescriptions. State nullification, I think, is a very interesting thing. I think it gets at really key theoretical vulnerabilities of written constitutionalism, that who gets to interpret, right? That's a big problem. But I don't necessarily see state nullification as, it's not really a live issue today. What I think Calhoun is valuable for is his general understanding of kind of the tendencies of popular government. I think most of that can be boiled down to his understanding of consolidation. And consolidation is kind of the opposite of his concurrent model of government. Consolidation is putting the levers of power together, right? Making it more accessible for one part of society to kind of reach out and grab and take, that the powers of government that are there to preserve society can so easily be misused to benefit one part of society over the other. So to the extent that we make it easier, we make it more attractive for people to do whatever is necessary to reach out and grab those powers of government and use it for us, rather than let somebody else get it and use it against us. So I think most of his value is in this is in kind of his understanding of consolidation and what that leads to. That so today, right, the national government can make law on pretty much everything. Right, there's like a sliver of, right, the old layer cake federalism, right, where the states have a tiny sliver at the bottom, but for the most part, the national government makes law on everything. So our politics becomes nationalized. Right? Goes along with making our politics more ideological, I think, because ideology cuts across all the differences here. It's something that you can unify people of a nation around, an ideology that cuts across all our locality or all our local concerns. Everybody focuses on the national government. how do you use the national government to your benefit? You have, you know, divided power stuff. Well, you erode all the limits, right? At the national government, Congress passes laws that authorize the president to just make decisions on his own about all sorts of things. I read a headline the other day that I didn't really look into, but it said that President Biden was considering revoking patent protections for COVID vaccines. I didn't really look into it or the legislative backing of it, but it just struck me. It's like, good grief, the president of the United States can just decide, right? That's the rule of law, right? That's constitutional government. Well, why? Probably, I'm guessing 20, 30 years ago, Congress passed some law that said the FDA could do that, right? Or the president could do that. So we erode that. We get rid of filibusters, right? We pack the court. We critique, you know, institutions like the Senate that don't, that make it more difficult for the same party to kind of gain control of all the parts of government. All right, we erode as many differences as possible so that more and more our politics is about, look, every 2 years, every 4 years, we're going to have one big showdown and all the marbles are there, right? That showdown is for everything. And that's, I think, that's what captures part of what Calhoun feared about consolidation, right? It's all there. So you're going to expect political dysfunction. You're going to expect very few personal limits of politicians. You're going to expect corruption abounding. And he even has a great line in the disquisition. I won't quote it directly because it would take too long, but basically at this situation, you're just going to have a political community where you have two parties that just basically bounce back and forth. It's just going to be a vibration between two parties. They're going to grab power, do everything they possibly can with it. Then the other party's going to win. They're going to undo everything the other one did and do everything they possibly can. And that's the end until somebody decides, right, they're going to appeal to force instead of politics, which sadly, you know, we're also kind of not as far away from as we used to be. So I think so that I think is the right it's his diagnosis, I think, more than his prescription, his diagnosis of popular government and how constitutionalism tries to prevent that political dysfunction. I think that's what's most useful for today.
John, that's a very, very interesting and very, very insightful thought to end on. And it seems to me that we'll probably, hopefully, animate some readers to take a look at Calhoun and at least try to set aside that piece of it. I appreciate you taking the time for the interview. I appreciate you take the time to write a great response essay and also engage this great conversation. And thanks for participating in the author interviews.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure.